That is too kind. That's really, thank you very much. Well, I am, after that very hopeful and really interesting talk by Josh, as usual, I'm a bit more downbeat. I was going to speak on how feminism is ruining academia. I'm speaking on that subject, but slightly oblique to that, what it is like to be a young man at university today, which, as far as I can see, amounts to nothing less than a totalizing program of indoctrination, surveillance, discipline, and punishment, under which men will live with the awareness of their second-class status for their entire university career. Everything in the university environment is woman-centered and, at best, indifferent, at worst, overtly hostile to men. Universities communicate to young men that their perceptions and experiences are valued less by university leadership than the perceptions and experiences of young women. That male success, well-being, and fair treatment matter far less to university leadership than the success, well-being, and special privileges of young women. And that because they are men, particularly if they are heterosexual, their very nature as men is a danger, and that anything they do on campus, including such actions as telling an off-color joke or making eye contact with a woman, can lead to charges of the new catch-all term, sexual misconduct. Charges of such misconduct will be investigated by administrators with no legal training, and in fact with a willed indifference to such legal concepts as the presumption of innocence, and with plenty of feminist brainwashing about female victimhood and the need to believe survivors. To enter a North American university today is to enter a climate that is full-on engaged in feminist-fueled groupthink about rape culture, which, according to the past chancellor at my university, who was a former Governor General of Canada, Michaëlle Jean, according to her, rape culture is a disease infecting all North American university campuses. Young men will repeatedly hear the false statistic that will not die, that 1 in 4 women is a victim of sexual assault. Some now are even referring to 1 in 3 women being a victim of sexual assault. They'll see posters like those that appeared on university campuses across Canada lecturing them, don't be that guy, showing men in a variety of lurid circumstances poised to take advantage of vulnerable women, with accompanying messages conveying to men their stupidity and their callousness. Messages like, quote, just because you helped her home doesn't mean you get to help yourself. It's impossible to imagine any similar poster campaign targeting any other identifiable group for such shaming. Young men at university will hear often about so-called scandals of sexual harassment and abusive treatment of women. And these are often incredibly trivial, in my opinion, often something involving social media, perhaps a group of students talking about another student in a sexualized way, as has happened at my university and at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, for instance. And much will be made of these incidents, always with the message that they are not isolated and certainly not insignificant occurrences of normal male sexual energy. Instead, they are spoken of as representing a much larger culture that demeans and terrorizes women, about which we are all to be aghast. Often the message expressed by the university is that these incidents reflect a widespread sexually predatory culture that supposedly benefits all men, and for which individual men of good conscience must make constant acknowledgement and reparation, even though those individual men had nothing to do with the incident, and the only effect on them, far from any benefit, is a ramped-up atmosphere of anti-male grandstanding. Young men will hear suggestions, such as that made at Dalhousie, that universities as a whole should adopt a formal policy by which women would speak first in every classroom, supposedly because men create hostile environments for women merely by their manner of speaking. They'll learn that some feminist professors have already adopted such a policy informally, with tacit approval from their university. They'll hear that male sexuality is about power and that it contributes to women's inequality, and therefore any sexual incident, no matter how trivial, almost always becomes the occasion for campus women's advocates to call for more to be done to address what they claim to be inequalities suffered by women at university, though, of course, as we all know, women now vastly outnumber men in nearly all disciplines. Young men will hear about the need, therefore, for more special scholarships for female students, more counseling for female victims, more self-defense classes for women wanting to protect themselves from male aggressors, more feminist programming to combat gender stereotypes, more official statements by the university about its support for women and its horror at male predatory sexuality, more measures to affirm women generally, and more measures to make campus life safer for women and more treacherous for men. Of course, there already are many measures in place to affirm academic women. There are special days set aside at the university to commemorate male violence against women. In Canada, that day is December 6th, the anniversary of the Montreal Massacre, a time in which women gather in tearful outrage to rehearse feminist themes about the continuum of violence under which all women supposedly live in fear. Other days are set aside for celebrations of female sexuality, as in performances of the vagina monologues, in which the central meaning of male-female sexual relations is of male abuse of women and the healing, liberating power of female sexuality. There are, of course, no days set aside to commemorate male victims of violence, and certainly never to celebrate male sexuality. If men wish to gather together to discuss their experiences as men, to form a men's issues group or to have a men's center, they are met with indignant protest, incredulity, and contemptuous declarations of male privilege. A few years ago, there were plans for a men's center at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. These were put on hold, probably permanently, when they were met with a wave of student disgust. Feminist students were quick to present their views on film, and this video is really worth watching if you haven't seen it. It's still available on Jonathan Taylor's website. These students came forward to denounce the idea of a men's center as misogynistic, as transphobic, as exclusionary and dangerous, supposedly a prime example of male entitlement. And the disgust and the contemptuousness with which these students feel entitled to speak about the idea of a men's center is really startling. Many of you probably heard it's just been discussed about the ill-fated attempt by York University last November to commemorate International Men's Day with a special focus on men's equality issues. The decision was immediately protested by anti-male activists in an open letter to the university asserting that while patriarchy did hurt men too, men's problems could never be compared to women's problems, which were structural in nature, supposedly unlike men's. That's the standard feminist response, even when the list of men's problems is very well documented. After 200 people signed this open letter, York University rescinded its decision to mark the day and offered a flagrantly feminist-compliant walk back, assuring the campus community that, quote, the Equality and Diversity Committee is clear that the main focus of gender equality work should continue to be on the inequalities faced by women, and in particular, the underrepresentation of women in the professoriate and in senior management. Now that's a staggering admission. The declaration that the underrepresentation of women in elite and high-paying positions at universities is a much greater and more pressing concern than, as was mentioned in the initial idea for International Men's Day commemoration, than the high proportion of men who kill themselves every year in society. If any group, male or female, attempts to bring in a men's advocate to address the problems of men and boys in our society, no matter the speaker, no matter the nature of the talk, there will often be feminist activists denouncing the talk as misogynistic, as making the campus unsafe for women. Often protesters will gather to shout obscenities at the attendees and often to attempt to disrupt the talk itself, and university administrators will do nothing or will actively intervene on the side of the protesters. So even to talk about male suicide or homelessness or educational inequalities is always countered as an unacceptable distraction from women's issues. Male dissent in any form is actively monitored and controlled. Yesterday, Martin Dobney, for instance, mentioned the case of George Lawler, whom some of you have heard about, Warwick University student who expressed his annoyance in the student newspaper at receiving an invitation from his university to attend a sexual consent class. He dared to say that he didn't need to attend such a class because he understood what consent was. For that, he was the target of a torrent of public anger, receiving hundreds of insulting and outraged messages, including death threats on Twitter and a great deal of negative media attention, because essentially he said the unsayable, that most young men don't need to be taught not to rape, and that being invited to a sexual consent class is really, in his words, a, quote, massive, painful, bitchy slap in the face. And he nailed it there. The hysterical denunciation that came his way strongly suggested that the anti-rape programming isn't about decreasing rape at all. It isn't about sexual assault victims. Lawler himself said he was opposed to sexual assault. He was pro-consent. He wanted a willing partner. Most men do. And he knew what that meant. If the anti-rape proponents really cared about victims, of course, they would have said, okay, this fellow legitimately doesn't need the classes. But these programs are about forcing men to accept their designated status as always potential rapists. And Lawler's refusal to accept his publicly sanctioned humiliation was intolerable to his many critics. For any male student watching the abuse he received, the message was pretty clear. If you don't go along with the orthodoxy, our moral leaders and their minions are going to do everything in their power to break your will. At my university, the reach and scope of the male-shaming campaign has been articulated in a 38-page document published online just over a year ago called Ending Sexual Violence at the University of Ottawa. And it is an astounding document. This document was commissioned by the university president in response to two campus incidents. One of them an entirely trivial, in my opinion, case of Facebook banter in which five students involved in student government made sexual comments. It was in a private Facebook page about the Student Federation leader. Somebody took a picture of the comments and sent it to her, and she capitalized on it. And that was the one incident. The second incident, a charge of sexual assault against two members of the varsity men's hockey team that's still unproven, as far as I know. It seems pretty clear it was a case of a drunken sexual hookup. These two incidents were widely reported to signal that the University of Ottawa was a rape culture, a culture in which rape is widespread and normalized, and so the president of the university struck a task force on sexual respect and equality to make recommendations about how to heal the campus. The document declares that its purpose is to create an environment, quote, where everyone on campus understands that sexual violence is unacceptable, where survivors receive the services they need, and where perpetrators are held accountable. Now, this is obviously an ambitious program for an institution of higher education, staffed mainly by narrowly trained specialists, very few of whom have any criminal justice training or any victim services training, but it is now quite typical of the mindset of universities in relation to the sexual activities and attitudes of students. And when one realizes how sexual violence is defined in the document, and of course it's defined in incredibly elastic terms, it includes so-called verbal harassment, it includes so-called disrespect, it includes so-called discriminatory attitudes, one begins to understand the radical vision of the task force report. I want to pause here just to stress how extraordinary it is that universities have become so actively engaged in the sexual lives of adult students, to such an extent that a massive apparatus of offices and counseling programs and workshops and policies and tribunals have grown up on campus, employing large numbers of people and occupying much of the conversation about academic life. How strange it is to find a university president enthusiastically endorsing recommendations about university policies and practices that would seem to any reasonable person, one would think, to be completely outside the purview of a university. Here's one example. This is from the task force report. Quote, the university needs to protect survivors, in other words, accusers, and privilege their voices during discussions of sexual violence on campus. For an institution, that would be the end of that quote. For an institution, the mandate of which is supposed to be to pursue truth and knowledge, the idea that particular voices and perspectives must be privileged and protected in campus discussions is just one of the many signs that the university has been entirely taken over by ideology and is no longer about truth-seeking at all. Of course, the president himself guaranteed such an overtly feminist emphasis in his selection of the report's authors. The task force was composed of 11 individuals, 9 of them women, including a number of prominent feminist ideologues. One of them a woman named Elizabeth Sheehy, whom some of you may recognize as the University of Ottawa law professor, distinguished by her advocacy that so-called battered women should be legally exonerated for killing their male partners if they can make the claim that the partner was a batterer and that they felt killing him, even if he was asleep at the time, was the only way to free themselves from his abuse. She actually compares battered women to prisoners of war who are morally justified in killing their captors. So what does it mean when a university president puts in charge of a document on respect and equality a woman who believes that heterosexual men, and of course only heterosexual men, can be killed with impunity by their female partners if it can be convincingly claimed that the dead man was abusive? She's not the only ideologue with an animus against men on the task force. Another one is a woman named Holly Johnson, an associate professor of criminology at the university, whose entire career has been built on supporting the feminist narrative of violence as a male preserve and women always the victims of violence. Johnson was the principal investigator of Statistics Canada's first national survey on violence against women, and she oversaw an anti-violence coalition that had on its website for at least a year false statistics about violence against women, in which the total number of victims of violence as reported by Statistics Canada was presented as the number of female victims of violence, with male victims of violence completely edited out of the picture. That sat up there on their website for at least a year. It took men's rights activist Dan Perrins, who I know some of you know, to force them finally to change their reporting. I contacted Holly Johnson and asked her why the statistic was up there months after Dan Perrins had already highlighted the fact it was there. She said they were having trouble with the website. It was really difficult to take the information down. So, and these are just 2 of the authors of the report. So the presence of these kinds of ideologues as authors of a document intended to chart the way forward for the university on matters of sexual equality isn't reassuring, to say the least. And predictably, what the document calls for is a further expansion of the university's anti-male programming, more feminist counseling, expanded campus law enforcement protocols relating to sexual harassment, expanded training for university administrators around issues such as sexual harassment, and perhaps most disturbingly, a university-wide education program that will reach into every aspect of university life. And all of these recommendations have been enthusiastically accepted by the president. The task force document begins from the premise that sexual violence is widespread and that it is, quote, both a cause and consequence of gender inequality. Now, despite their own survey data, the survey data of the authors of the report, showing that men experience comparable or near comparable levels of harassment and violence on campus, the framework authors posit a male-dominated culture in which sexual conduct is always about women's inequality. So, predictably, of course, men are the target for all the anti-violence programs, and women are the protected and privileged victims. In addition to lauding what is called bystander intervention, by which, as far as I can tell, has meant that students are encouraged to police one another's remarks, jokes, and attitudes. The emphasis in the document is on what is called gender transformative programming. This involves, the report authors tell us, quote, challenging negative gender role ideals and sparking a change to more positive masculinities. So more positive masculinities. In other words, the envisioned reach of these programs is far beyond merely educating about sexual assault. It is about transforming every element of masculine identity from a feminist point of view that despises everything about masculine identity. One of the most ambitious and, in my opinion, hideous recommendations to the university of the report is that, quote, the university should strike a campus-wide committee to review the existing curriculum across the faculties, especially first and second year courses, to ensure inclusion of issues related to women, gender and gender-based violence, race, sexuality, disability, and indigeneity. The university should identify all of the courses that deal with forms of gender-based violence using an intersectional lens. Each academic unit would be responsible for providing a list of courses. Units in which there are few courses with such content would be encouraged to develop their own courses that respond to these issues. Can you imagine faculty members in the Department of Physics, for example, or civil engineering, or library sciences, or accounting, or chemistry, or even religious studies having to set aside time every year to provide a list of courses dealing with gender-based violence, etc., or to develop such courses in order to satisfy the committee overseeing the recommendations of the task force? It is a completely unacceptable meddling by a group of ideologues in the course content of academic programs, yet I fully expect that it will take place. And in fact, of course, it is already taking place, not only at my university, but at all universities. There are very few academic programs at English-speaking universities that have not in some way or other been transformed by anti-male theorizing and activism, whether in course content or in the attitudes and preoccupations. Thank you. Attitudes and preoccupations of departments as a whole. I'm going to try to finish up here. I had a few more things. I went way over what I intended to write. I'll just talk about the study of English literature briefly, and then I'll close it off. The study of English literature has certainly been altered all out of recognition, such that the forms and ideas of literature have definitely taken a back seat to the adopting of approved positions, the most fundamental being that white heterosexual men are responsible for all the evils of the world. The Western culture such men created is uniquely oppressive, and that the literary work of women, sexual minorities, and non-white others must be celebrated as part of resistance against Western heteropatriarchal tyranny. No male student taking a literature course could fail to notice the different evaluative measures used for male versus female texts. Male authored texts are read against the grain, as it is said, to discover their submerged or overt white heteropatriarchal supremacism, their exploitative capitalism, their ecological terrorism, their repressed transphobia, their extermination as xenophobia, masking as exotic orientalist nostalgia, and so on. I can do it. I learned how to do it. Women-authored texts, on the other hand, women-authored texts are read for their resistance to these oppressive narratives, their voicing of women's silenced realities, their celebration of female subjectivity and desire. So obviously everything female is good unless it is complicit with patriarchal norms, and everything male is bad unless it resists patriarchal norms. These kinds of anti-male assumptions have deformed all of humanities education and much social science teaching as well. And the rod is spreading further. I was going to speak briefly about what seems to be going on in the hard sciences as well, which used to be a place where, really brilliant men could hide out from the gender wars on campus, but it seems that isn't the case anymore either. And why would feminists have allowed there to be any oasis apart from, their aggressive predation? They are now invading the hard sciences as well. So everything we see in higher education, whether outright discrimination in favor of women or the obsession with feminist gender politics and course content, has to do with making academia a place that favors and promotes women, and an extremely unpleasant and unwelcoming place to be a man. So what can we do about this situation? This is the question. Change will require a mass movement of students, both male and female, and parents, both mothers and fathers, believing that men's lives matter equally with women's lives. It will take a new narrative among women to affirm that freedom requires responsibility and that self-respect requires appropriate gratitude. All of us here are part of creating that new narrative, but I fear it will be a long while forming and that too many men's lives will be destroyed before it does. But maybe we can talk about something more hopeful in the Q&A. So thank you.